Good afternoon, everyone. Hope my name is Mark Cohn. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Air Management Association, and we hope you're having and enjoying your December. Today, we have an exciting webinar to provide you with some information regarding the interconnection between air pollution and how the electric grid impacts that. I do not want to get into anything further because we have three great experts to provide you with the latest ideas on how we may be able to influence utility regulations and regulators to help consider air quality when doing their planning. In one corner of our webinar, we have the Executive Director of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, Miles Keogh, who is going to start the event. Miles, in addition to his being Executive Director of NACAA for the last 10 years, has multiple years of experience in the energy sector and spent time in Ukraine consulting on their energy issues. Next, we have Nancy Seidman from the Regulatory Assistance Project. She has spent her career working on many clean air activities and energy sector, much of the time in Massachusetts. And in the last corner of our webinar, we have Richard Sedano of the Regulatory Assistance Project, who has spent many years educating utility regulators on many aspects of the energy sector. He spent years working for the Vermont Department of Public Service. All of their Nancy and Rich's bios can be seen on the Regulatory Assistance Project website. So with no further ado, I want to get us going with having Miles lead us into this exciting topic.
Real
Thanks,
quick,
Mark.
sorry, somebody just said in the chat that they can't hear. Can others not hear?
I can hear.
Okay, all right. It might have just been a that person's technology issue. Okay, all right, go ahead. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, hey friends. It's so nice to see so many folks who are the names of so many familiar friends in the room. It's a delight to get to chat with you. As Mark said, I'm Miles. I get the nice corner office here at the National Association of Clean Air Agencies. And, you know, Mark gave a pretty good bio there. In my time between NACAA and my last job at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and siting power plants in Massachusetts and working in the wind industry, I've sited 9 energy facilities. I've advised hundreds of utility commissioners. I've trained people in all 50 states. I've run stuff in a bunch of countries, trying to explain how the grid works and how power works and what it means about the planet and people's public health and that kind of stuff. And none of what I'm going to talk to you today draws on that experience. It's mostly because I have 2 teenage kids who are constantly sitting at the dinner table and holding forth on views that emerged from their brains, fully formed, like Athena jumping from the forehead of Zeus. And those theories or ideas or, you know, facts are all totally wrong. So a lot of why I understand some of this stuff comes from me scratching my head and being like, well, I got to explain to my kids why what they're saying is wrong. So almost everything I'm going to say today is going to be kind of oversimplified. But if you have questions, you know, I'm happy to slow down and do the more complex version. Jesse, would you jump us to the next slide? Okay. So my plan for today is to basically start right down at the electrons of this thing. I'm going to talk about why electricity works the way it does. I'm going to use tons of weird metaphors throughout. Please don't make fun of me for those. I'm going to talk about how power plants work and why they run at different times and who pays them to run at different times and the like. I've got a bunch of cool maps of the power fleet, of the grid, of how jurisdictions overlay on top of that, how regulation and states overlay over that. I'm going to bundle it all up to sort of explain, like, where are we with the grid now? And then talk a little bit about what could happen next and why it could happen next that way. And then I'm going to turn things over to the experts from the Regulatory Assistance Project, who are way smarter than me on this and will not fool around with oversimplification the way that I do. So Jesse, let's do the next slide, please. So what even is electricity, right? I mean, this is a thing that we use constantly every day. If you spend a day without electricity, it's a very memorable day. You're camping or you're, trapped after a hurricane or something like that. But it's pretty hard to explain what it is. Electricity is the movement of electrons between atoms. When an electron hops off of one atom and onto the next one, and another one hops off of that one and onto the next one, and those electrons move, that is current. When they all pile up in one place, that is charge. What we found out in 1831 was the scientist Michael Faraday figured out that if you twirl magnets inside a barrel-shaped coiled copper wire, that an electric current flows in the wire. And what happens is that the magnets are moving an electromagnetic force that pushes the electrons in the wire, and that creates current. It's basically converting the mechanical energy of the spinning magnets, which spin their electromagnetic fields with them. It converts that mechanical energy into electrical energy as those electrons hop from one atom to the next, right? That's like, I know we're a little bit Bill Nye the Science Guy, Nickelodeon level science here, but that's what electricity is. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what that means is that to make power, what you need to spin magnets. You need to make mechanical energy in order to convert it into electrical energy. Today we have a whole series of insulated coils of wire that form the stationary cylinder around these magnets. And the larger the spinning coil magnet setup, which we call a turbine, the larger that system is, the more it converts mechanical energy into electrical energy. And there are a few different ways that we make that spinning happen. We have kinetic energy. So like you've seen a wind turbine, the wind blows through the rotor swept area and spins the turbine. It actually goes through a gearbox and some other stuff, but we're oversimplifying here. There's also hydro, right? Hydropower. You build up a bunch of pressure behind a dam and then water falls down inside the dam and rushes through the turbine, through the blades, causing it to spin. We have combustion turbines and steam turbines where you burn gas, oil, or coal. Sometimes you boil water, or sometimes it works like a jet engine. We have nuclear power that boils water and runs through steam turbines. And then we have photovoltaic and solar power that use electrons in sheets of glass. Essentially, the light converts creates the movement of electrons and creates the electrical energy. I was at a meeting yesterday where someone says they're plates of glass that print money, and we'll get into why that's true later on in my little talk here. Let's go to the next slide. All of a sudden, mysteries of turbines have been disambiguated for you with my oversimplification. So I hope that's helpful so far. So once we have created electrical energy, how do we move it around the system? Essentially, once the electrons start moving, we increase or decrease the pressure of those electrons, like the pressure of water in pipes. But we don't call it pressure when it's electricity. We call it voltage. At the power plant, the voltage is extremely high. We use a transformer to step up or step down the amount of voltage to go into a bulk transmission system, big fat electrical pipes, to send those out to the places where people use it. We use another transformer to then reduce that pressure, reduce that voltage down to something that's safe to have in people's houses. And then it goes into houses on different distribution lines. So the three different components of the electrical system that are sort of the leg bone connected to the knee bone skeleton of the power system are generation, transmission, distribution, and end use. And there's opportunities and challenges at each of those points for our community and for states and for other regulators to weigh in on. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jesse. So you'd think once you send a little old electron out into the world from the power plant that it can just go anywhere. It can just go anywhere where a wire will take it. Well, these are where the wires will take them. The United States, and as it turns out, Canada and the northern part of Mexico are all interconnected, not in one system, but in 3 systems. We have the Western interconnection that serves everybody in the West. We have the Eastern interconnection that serves everybody in the East. And we have the Texas interconnection that serves Texas. These different interconnections are phased differently, and so they don't really talk to each other. You can't really communicate, with some exceptions. There's some connection points, but they're pretty limited. But essentially, power that's generated anywhere in the East stays in the Eastern interconnection. Power that's generated anywhere in the West stays in the Western interconnection. And power that's generated in Texas tends to stay in that, it's most of Texas, in the Texas interconnection. And so that affects where you sit, it affects where you can generate and receive power from. Let's go to the next slide. Now we get to the part that I really love. I love power plants, y'all. I actually love transmission lines too. One time my kids and I were in California on vacation. They were pretty young, and I took them 90 minutes out of the way to go drive to the middle of nowhere to go look at a really great transmission line that I was really excited about, Path 9. And my kids got out of the minivan and they were like, "What are we looking at, Dad?" And I was like, "Behold, Path 9. And they're like, "Dad, we have these in Virginia. I'm not talking to you till we get to Disneyland." So I did take them right to Disneyland right after that. But I love transmission. I also love power plants, and I love all kinds of power plants. I know that all power plants have their trade-offs, but I sincerely love them all. Power plants do 2 things. They have a capacity, which is measured in megawatts, and that's how much stuff, how much power can they make at any given time, at any snapshot. It's like asking, how many books will fit on this bookshelf? They also have energy, and energy is how many books were sitting on that bookshelf over the course of the year as I took books off and put books on to read them over time, etc. The capacity is how much you can do at any time. The energy is how much they did over a measured period of time, like a year. And capacity is measured in megawatts, and energy is measured in megawatt hours. In the United States, we got about 12,000, a little more than 12,000 utility scale power plants. There's about twice that number if you count all the little ones that aren't at utility scale. We've got about 1,900 natural gas power plants. And that is a fleet that is growing. We added 16 new natural gas-fired power plants at utility scale in 2023. There are 20 that are in the construction pipeline to be completed in 2024. And looking out into the future, we've got 133 more that are announced and somewhere in the project development pipeline and permitting stack. So we've got a bunch of gas plants and we've got a bunch more. That's really a lot of the fossil plants that are being built. We have about 200 coal-fired power plants in this country, and that number is dropping precipitously. And for economic reasons, which we'll get into in a little bit, and for environmental reasons, which I won't get into too much because you guys already know, that number is expected to continue to decline over the next coming years. We also have 94 nuclear power reactors. That's not nuclear power plants. One of my favorite power plants is one in Maryland called Calvert Cliffs that has 2 reactors. We have 94 nuclear power reactors here in the United States. Solar is a massively growing concern. In 2014, it was about 0.5% of the capacity in the fleet. Now it's about 10% of the capacity in the fleet. In 10 years, it's grown that much. Wind is now about 13% of the fleet. It's also grown like crazy. And we haven't really seen exactly what the IRA investments will yield for that. But no matter what happens with the next administration, 2024 and 2025 should be pretty record-breaking years for wind and solar as well. So that's the fleet. Isn't it beautiful? You can see it's spread out pretty evenly across the country. In the Northwest, we have a lot of hydro. In the Southeast, we have a lot of coal and gas. Appalachian area, Ohio River Valley, a lot of coal. Those green dots are wind. You get those out on the Great Plains, and more solar everywhere. Let's go to the next slide, Jesse. So remember I had differentiated how much capacity there was out in the world. That last slide was a capacity map. It measured megawatts. How much could you get out of those? Not how much are they actually running and how much are they actually producing. And so the next question is not how much megawatts installed capacity do we have, but who's actually running? Who's actually moving megawatt hours onto the system and producing electricity? Because you can have a super dirty plant that has zero emissions if it never turns on. So here's who's running. Natural gas is running a lot. Coal is running a lot less than it was running 10 years ago, but still plays a pretty robust piece of the portfolio there. Nuclear is just steady Eddie at 20%. There's not a lot of reactors shutting down. There's very few new reactors coming online. They're extremely high efficiency and capacity. They don't ramp up and down much. You just basically turn them on and they run. And then every couple of years, you have to take them down to refuel them. And that's really the only change you get out of them. They're very steady, both in terms of capacity and in terms of the contribution of megawatt hours. Renewables, as you see in that green part, have been growing like crazy, and hydropower kind of behaves like nuclear. It's just very steady Eddie. One problem with new capacity is how long it takes to get new units put onto the grid. There are all kinds of constraints around this with siting, with getting an interconnection to the transmission system out of the queue and the like. But just in terms of how fast you can actually procure and construct a facility, there are big differences in how long each of these things take. Solar and wind take between 1 year and 2 years to put a plant on, outside of the interconnection queue questions, outside of the siting questions. Gas, there's about a 4-year wait right now for a new gas turbine. So it's at least 5 before you can bring a gas turbine online. And then a unit like a nuclear unit takes a super long time. If you can get a nuclear unit built in 10 years, that is a blistering sprint. It's more like about 20 years in recent experience to get a nuclear unit put aboard. Jesse, let's do the next slide. Okay, I'm just going to note that combustion is a chemical thing. It's a reaction that you learn about in chemistry. If you take like natural gas, whose chemical signature is CH4, and you combine it with oxygen and a little bit of energy to do the chemical equation of combustion, then the C's and the O's fall in love and you get CO2. And that always happens. There is no combustion without CO2. This is our energy consumption by source in the United States for 2023. It's all energy combustion, including electricity, industrial, transportation, which is why petroleum plays such a big role up there. We don't actually make that much power in the United States out of petroleum. There are places, especially island areas, that sometimes rely pretty heavily on petroleum. But the United States doesn't tend to have a lot of those areas anymore. But as you can see, those sources of fuel are the only ones that create carbon dioxide and really most of the other air pollutants that y'all deal with. Let's go to the next slide, please. Not all plants run all the time. this looks like it's a sort of like an esoteric painting of the Himalayas in the distance, right? You're looking at the great fields over there, and then as you get peakier and peakier, there's like the snow-capped peaks. But actually, what that looks like is a load curve, right? It's how much power are people using during the day, and as more people use power for industrial uses, for turning on the lights in their house, for running their Alexa, for doing whatever it is, as they consume more electricity, generators have to ramp up and produce that electricity to match it and balance it at all times. And then as people use less, you turn off more power plants and you ramp down to match that. And you can see the bottom axis there is the time of day, and the top axis there is how many megawatts it is. And this is just hypothetical. Imagine this is the power system of Narnia or something. This is only meant to be indicative. In the morning, you see that it's a low curve. And then around 6, 8 a.m., people start waking up, making coffee, going into the office, turning on the steel mills, et cetera, et cetera. Things peak out around 5 p.m. as people are kind of like starting to ramp down their commercial and residential use, et cetera, and it continues to decline into the night. That's a pretty typical looking load curve for a typical day in a typical place. And so you run different kinds of power plants to serve that load at different times of day. You turn on your steady eddy load, your cheap load, your cheap supply, your cheap load serving entities to just sort of run as base load. And then you turn on additional units during the day to meet that growing need as people use power during the day. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jesse. So how do we pick which plant is going to run? Almost everywhere we do it based on price. And so the way that you figure out how much the price is in almost every place, including in places where they own the power plants. They dispatch according to whoever's cheapest goes first, whoever is a little more expensive goes next, and so forth. In a lot of the areas of the country, we run auctions, and I'll explain in the next slide where we run auctions to do that. But on a minute-by-minute basis, the person who's doing the balancing of supply and demand will see that what they need is, say, 525 megawatts, which is where that red line is on that chart there. They say, well, we need 525 megawatts right now. And they tell all the power plants, tell us how much you can give us and at what price. And you see the wind turbine fellas show up there in blue. One guy says, I can give it to you at $30. I can give you this much at $50. Why is wind so cheap? Well, you're not buying any fuel. The only thing you're paying for, because the wind is free, the only thing you're paying for is the mortgage on your wind turbine, which is also pretty cheap. Then the next couple folks show up. It's a couple natural gas people. The lady with the $100 plant shows up. The lady with the $110 plant shows up. When gas is inexpensive, they bid pretty inexpensively. So they get into the bid stack pretty cheap. Then a nuclear unit shows up. Then a gentleman with a coal plant shows up. And those guys all together are able to serve the cheapest amount of load. If you stacked up all what they're able to supply, it would be 525 megawatts. Then another coal plant guy shows up and he says, I've got power that I could give you for 160. And the balancing operator, the person who's running the auction, says, well, we don't need you. And then everybody who bids under the clearing price gets paid the clearing price. If we were all in the room together, I'd ask you guys, what's the clearing price? But I can't see any of you. So I'm just going to tell you, it's $150. It's set by that marginal coal plant. That is the unit that meets the amount of load in total that they're able to stack for the cheapest. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jesse. So where do we run these old auctions? Well, this is where all over America, we have balancing authorities that balance load and supply, that dispatch power plants, that watch how much current is needed, watch how much load is out there, that, demand for power is out there, pulling electrons into the system. But in these places that are colored on this map here, we have independent system operators that manage the reliability, that manage the resource adequacy, that manage the excess capacity requirements, and that manage these energy markets. And As you can probably tell from MARAMA, almost everybody is in PJM except for New York is in its own independent system operator system. Places that are in white there, they don't have independent system operators. They have other kinds of ways of running these balancing authorities, but they also dispatch their cheapest units first and use essentially the same thing. It's just they know how much they can bid it for because they own those power plants, so it's not run via an auction. But that same merit order dispatch, where the cheapest folks run and you build a bid stack out of being able to supply, and that's how you know what the price of power is, that works for those other areas that are in white too. Let's go to the next slide, please, Jesse. So in some parts of the country, we've done something called restructuring, where we've asked our utilities to unbundle the assets that they own. And in other areas, we have not unbundled our utilities. Oh, you've jumped ahead of me. There you go. Perfect. Where we haven't unbundled utilities, where we have vertically integrated utilities, those utilities own the power plant there on the left. They own the transmission line there in the middle, both in that green box there. They own the distribution system, and they serve retail load. They do the billing, and they do the last mile stuff, and they read meters and that kind of stuff. Those are vertically integrated utilities. In other parts of the country, and PJM is dominated by a lot of these ways of doing business, we have unbundled utilities. Those utilities only serve distribution system and retail load kinds of questions. They don't own power plants, and they don't run the bulk system. The bulk system is run by other parties and managed by the independent system operators, and the power plants are their own companies. They're independent power producers or merchants in a lot of cases. There are important exceptions, and there's every state looks a little bit different, but those two, we're oversimplifying here today. Those two models, vertical integration and unbundled, are two of the most common ways that utilities are organized. All right, let's go to the next slide. That makes regulating the power plants a little bit difficult. Not difficult, it just complicates it because different kinds of organizations own different kinds of power plants in different places. And so different jurisdictional authorities have different powers in different places. To regulators, you'll see that in places like Texas, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, et cetera, where you have these unbundled utilities, you can't just go to the utility and say, turn up or turn down, build or don't build a power plant, because they don't own power plants. They buy their power off of the independent system operator. In places where there's vertical integration, places like Florida, Alabama, Tennessee, Utah, et cetera, those companies that are regulated by the state do in fact own power plants. They don't own all the power plants. We'll get into that in just a second. All right, let's go to the next slide. To air agencies, the map looks pretty different, right? We care about what comes out of the smokestacks from these power plants, or doesn't, depending on where you're getting the power. We care about upwind pollution. We care about things that contribute to our own attainment or non-attainment status. And we care about the implications for permitting for energy facilities and the implications of permitting an energy facility for permitting everything else. Let's continue to the next slide. And sometimes we also think the map looks like this. This is a map of a ginormous wildfire from 2017 that was happening in the Pacific Northwest that carried smoke way across the country. Of course, wildfire risks are strongly exacerbated by climate change, and climate change is also going to make ozone seasons longer and more severe as temperatures stretch out the summer season because of increasing temperatures. And for other reasons, climate change actually exacerbates problems that we have with ozone season in places where that's of concern, which is a lot of places. a lot of places in the MARAMA states. All right, let's carry on. The next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about how much different kinds of power bid into these bid stacks. How often a power plant runs is often a question of how much it costs to build it and run it. And this is a pretty recent Lazard LCOE comparison. But what you'll see is that wind, which is the cheapest thing on the screen there, onshore wind at $27, is one of the cheapest units to build, and it's one of the cheapest units to run. And solar PV at utility scale is also cheaper than almost everything. If you get down into conventional energy, gas combined cycle is very competitively priced. It's the cheapest fossil fuel unit that's out there, whereas coal and nuclear are, for economic reasons, having a really hard time competing right now. And that's not me being pejorative or me judging those units. Remember, I love power plants. It's just that the economics of constructing and operating those units are higher than for things like gas, onshore wind, and solar that's deployed by the utilities. One thing I'll note on this is just because a unit is not super economic doesn't always mean that it doesn't show up. You'll see in conventional energy there that the highest priced units that are on there are gas peaking. And you do need gas peaking units or something that does that has the same kind of performance characteristics to match, to balance the supply and demand. It's hard to turn up a solar unit. It's hard to turn up a wind unit if there's more demand. Those are not load following units. And you need other kinds of units that you can ramp up and down to follow the amount of supply that you need to balance supply and demand. I want to say one more thing. There's a great question. Does the levelized cost include subsidies? It does not right now. So this is unsubsidized. Without the PTC or ITC, or those are the two big subsidies, the production tax credit and investment tax credit. One of the things that informs us here is what the price of the fuel is as well. For things like wind and solar, there's no price for the fuel, it's free. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what's happening here with the amount of power that we need? These charts don't show what's happening with our ability to supply electricity. These charts show for different areas of the country how much demand we have out there on the system. The top one there shows for those market areas, not for the all the different, like all the different areas of the country, but for the market areas and for WEC and CERC. WEC is in the west and CERC is in the southeast. What the electricity demand forecasts are. That first set of sort of pyramidal bars that are going up there is, I think, 2023. The second set is 2035, and the last is 2050. And what you'll see is that in PJM, for example, which is the gray guy there, we expect about a 25% load growth just in terms of normal expected economic load growth. There's two factors that are compounding these kinds of questions that are known unknowns, which I'll get into it in a sec. You'll also see that in other parts of the country, like PJM, which is one of the largest electricity demand areas of the country, you'll see that demand in California, which is represented by that CAISO, C-A-I-S-O, and demand in New England, which is ISO New England, or that darkest gray thing. For both of those, demand more or less doubles. And that's just economic growth. The two unknowns that are really big drivers of unknowns here are, one, if we electrify things more, electrifying transportation from a switch from internal combustion engine to EV vehicles, and if we electrify buildings and industry, that could cause higher than expected load growth. And the other question is this data centers question. I live in Virginia, and there's a county just south of DC here called Prince William County. And when you drive through Prince William County, when you drove through Prince William County 5 years ago, it was fields and some suburbs, a lot of farmland. What it looks like now is data center after data center after data center. And what that's caused in Prince William County is a huge spike in load growth. The bottom graph here is for Dominion Resources, which is the utility. Dominion's my utility in Virginia. What their expected load growth looked like. The blue line there is what they thought summer peak would look like out through 2037. That was their 2022 forecast. In 2023, you could see it was significantly higher. And then at the beginning of 2024, they ran this electrification adjusted for data centers forecast. And you can see it's more or less doubled the increase that they expected. And where we have these data centers, it's really expected to drive a lot of demand growth, which we're not sitting ducks here, friends. We can do stuff with energy efficiency. We can do stuff with improved siting. We can do stuff with, the load, the power usage at data centers creates a lot of heat, and we can do some combined heat and power stuff. There's a lot of opportunities. We're not just going to sit here and get clobbered by this thing. But if we didn't do anything else about it, we'd expect an enormous load increase that's driven by these data centers, which I'm sure we'll get into later. Let's go to the next slide, please. So load's growing. So we need to build a bunch of power plants, right? And knowing, we think, maybe, or do a lot of energy efficiency, or do a lot more transmission, or do something. We can't just sit here and do nothing. Any of you guys remember Donald Rumsfeld's iconic February 2002 haiku? I'm going to read it to you. I was going to make this a video where I actually got to show Donald Rumsfeld delivering this, but I'm just going to read it to you because it's one of the signature pieces of English literature of our time. As we know, said Donald Rumsfeld, then the Secretary of Defense, as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. Moment of silence. So profound. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. So here's my known unknown list. First on my known unknowns list, the things I know, I don't know what's going to happen. 1, a return to rollbacks. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but we just had an election, and it seems the new administration is interested in driving energy policy in a very specific set of directions, and not all of those are the directions that we are currently headed in. So we don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know if carbon is going to be a driving force in the power sector or not. We don't know if gas prices and those kinds of things are going to stay the same. Speaking of gas prices, natural gas prices, or fossil gas, or methane, or whatever you want to call it, those are known unknowns. I looked today, the price of natural gas at the Henry Hub was $2.10 an MMBTU, which is really cheap. That's a cheap price for natural gas at Henry Hub. It's usually between $2 and $4 bucks an MMBTU. Jesse, I'm just checking what this message is. Okay, thanks. In January of 2024, there was a spike in natural gas prices to $13 an MMBTU, which that's a 6 times increase in price. Imagine if you were paying $2 a gallon for gas and then you showed up to the pump one day and it was suddenly $13 a gallon for gasoline, you would be pretty mad. But most of us sailed through this January price spike to $13 an MMBTU without any kind of sweating. Before January 2023, gas prices were fluctuating between about $4 and $7 an MMBTU. So that's pretty cheap right now. We're in an era of a moment of cheap gas. And will that stay the same or will it not? It's a known unknown. We don't know what's going to happen with load. That's the 600-pound gorilla. We know it's going to grow. That's why it's not itself the 800-pound gorilla. But we don't know what's going to happen with data centers and energy efficiency and what'll happen with growth in that. Another known unknown is the solar and storage disruptor juggernaut. The price of solar has been absolutely plummeting, and we don't know if it'll continue to plummet or not. If you can match it with storage, it's pretty indistinguishable from a gas unit. So if it's a third of the price of a gas unit, you'll see a lot of solar and storage. And if it's not, if it's the same as a gas unit, we might see gas units come online. Another unknown is what'll happen with those 94 reactors. A lot of them are getting pretty old. If you turn off a 2,000 megawatt nuclear power plant, you suddenly have to find 2,000 megawatts of other energy. And maybe that's fossil energy, or maybe it's clean energy, but it means it needs to be replaced. And right now, it's zero carbon energy. And then finally, there's a ton of other things about transactions and business models. And will Tesla take off? Will there'll be scandals in the DOE loan programs office? Will weatherization happen or not? And all of these known unknowns are probably tiny compared to the unknown unknowns, which we can't even speculate about. Is an asteroid going to hit the world? Will there be a zombie apocalypse? Is there going to be, like troops sent to Belarus? The unknown unknowns, it's impossible to even try to speculate those out. Last slide for me, please, Jesse. One thing we do know, though, is that tomorrow is not going to be like today. I was talking to the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and I said the stupidest quote I have ever given a reporter before, and thank God they ran the story without it. They said, what can we expect with this? And I said, I don't know. And they said, what can we expect with that? And I said, I don't know. And they were like, well, what can we expect? And I said, we live in an age of wonders. All we can expect is that we will be surprised. And if that sounds like I was maybe, like having a couple whiskeys before I talked to the guy, no, I wasn't. I just sound like that sometimes. But we do, in fact, know that tomorrow will be different. And all we can expect is that we're going to be surprised. That, last slide for me, please, Jesse, concludes my presentation. I know there will be questions, but I bet you they'll be even better after they're answered by Rap. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Miles. And thank you, Jesse, for continuing to get us through the slides. I think we'll move on to Nancy and Richard's presentation and get to the questions.
Mark, do we want to do one poll first? I can't remember if that was.
Well, we didn't. We were not sure whether we had how close we're running up against time.
Okay, no, we can move on. That's fine. That's great.
Okay, great job, Miles. Appreciate everything. And hang around, and hopefully you'll get some questions.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with the MARAMA states again and to see some familiar names amongst those who are on the webinar. My name is Nancy Seidman, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Rich Sedano, and we'll be sharing our presentation. And thank you, Miles, for kicking us off with so much enthusiasm and information. Next slide, please. So here's no, back up one, I think. Great, thank you. So here's an outline of the topics Rich and I are planning to cover today. We're going to start with transmission and the relevant regional and federal organizations and try to link those to your job and your missions. We're going to link current and future generation sources to transmission and electrification, and then conclude with where we see opportunities for you, including some case studies. We've got a lot of content today. We won't be able to talk about it all. And we encourage you to focus on your areas of interest when you ask questions, and we can go into greater detail. And we have about 25 or 30-minute presentation, so we hope you all are going to be able to stick around. Next slide, please. So here's a message that we hope to convey today, that clean technologies are here to stay and that they are less expensive. And we hope you can take this to heart and think about how your work can improve the rate of change of clean technologies, and so that we can improve air quality and public health. And we're aiming to show you some ways this can be done and how you can help. Next slide, please. Let's start with some transmission essentials, some of which Miles touched on. Next slide, please. So to reiterate, all of the US is part of a control area for delivering electricity, which includes the 3 items mentioned on the slide beyond daily operations. Those 3 are ensuring reliability, conducting planning, and using markets to transfer power and to get it to consumers. It's important to note that participation in a regional transmission organization or an RTO is voluntary. Miles was using the term an ISO, and an ISO and an RTO are basically a same term for a different term for the same thing. And we want to note that an RTO can be a group of members or a single utility. They have complicated governance structures, which is important to understand if you want to influence the process, and we hope you will want to try to do that. I mean, for example, transmission owners' participation in RTO is voluntary, and if they don't like what's going on in their current RTO, they can depart or try to get a better deal from another one, which will be important for some things we're talking about later. But you want to recall that they have more power than other sectors in an RTO. And the governance in an RTO is governed by the sectors, and there are generally 5 sectors: transmission, generation, distribution, independent power producers or distributed resources, and then advocates and other outside parties. And admittedly, following what's going on in an RTO is tough. And in general, folks have dedicated staff who follow what's going on, or so you all might want to try to find somebody you could trust to follow this for you and advise you when to chime in, for perhaps someone in your Public Utility Commission. And you'll note that I did not mention environment as one of the sectors, which we think should be part at least of the planning in an RTO. And it sometimes is. For example, you may be called upon to weigh in on the need to retrofit or retire facilities. Those are key planning elements and should include, and we think they should include you. Next slide, please. So as Miles noted, I've been noticing our slides, when we combine decks, the wrap slides got mixed with Miles' logo. So we will send out a version that shows you these in a little bit better format. Oh, Jesse, you're going to try to revert to our deck?
Yep.
Okay.
Just give me 1 second. I'm really sorry about that. I'm just going to go to your slide deck
I
really
understand
quick. I'll make things easier.
Okay. Well,
Yep,
you'll see what we're going to go back to is the map of the PJM states. And just for reference, PJM used to stand for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. And that's your regional transmission operator, or RTO, which serves the 13 states and DC. And PJM's job is to ensure that all the generators who are in the dark blue area, it would be slide 6, yeah. There we go, thank you. Have open access to transmission lines and the ability to sell power into a large wholesale market. So this means that decisions about which power plants operate to serve load in PJM are not made by the power plant operators, but by PJM. And it's important because it means your authority as the air regulators to regulate times when the plants run is affected by PJM's rules or governance. So we're interested in who in this group has worked with PJM, if any of you have, and what your experience has been. Next slide, please. So to expand on the potential for you to influence the process, we have good news and bad news. The bad news is there really isn't a hard obligation to involve you. But on the good news side, there's some effort to change that, especially given state policies to, like, for example, reduce greenhouse gas emissions or ensure the growth of renewable energy. And perhaps efforts by your commission to do rate structures to influence peak demands. And your ability to participate in the process has been helped some by recent Federal Energy Regulatory Commission orders. FERC Order 1920 is a recent one. And Rich is going to discuss 1920 a little bit in a coming slide. However, as we note at the bottom, conflicting state policies can mean that the RTO isn't sure what to do and therefore may not do anything or doesn't do what you want, which doesn't help us with the process. So the more states can be aligned in speaking with and talking to PJM and asking for things, the better. Which brings us to a poll question. Next slide, please. Let's see if this works. So the poll question is, what is OPSI? And then we have provided 4 options, I think, Jesse, for you to select, if that's going to work.
Just one moment.
Yep, sure.
It's our first time using this, so.
I get it.
Really,
Yeah.
really guinea pigs.
Yep.
Yeah. Can you all see that?
I do not, but
sorry. No, this isn't working. We were able to do it earlier.
Oh.
Still not seeing it?
Somebody is saying in the chat that they can see it, although I can't.
You're seeing what is OPSI?
Oh, the slide. No, there's a poll, Jenny, that Jesse's trying to show, but if it's not showing, perhaps we should just
move on.
Improvise and move on.
Yes.
Yeah. If folks want to put their responses in the chat just while Nancy speaks, that would be, or we could take a minute, and you could put your responses in the chat.
Oh, someone's saying there's a poll button at the bottom that you can click on.
Somebody
got it.
Okay. Is it?
There it is.
Can you all see it now?
Okay.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay, great. Sorry about that.
So go ahead and choose your answer, and then we'll go back and answer that. We'll give Jesse, I'm assuming you can see if folks are answering.
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, can't choose. Oh, someone's saying they can't choose. Oh, for Jesse only. Okay.
Oh.
Anyway, let's go back to the slides. You all saw that there was one fun answer that was a rabbit in the Peter Rabbit story. The second one was one actually I made up. The real answer is the third answer, the organization of PJM states. So Jesse, if we go back to the slides, that slide that is yeah. So OPSI stands for the Organization of PJM States Incorporated, I believe. And that is how state policies are supposed to be conveyed to PJM in the normal course of business. Of course, that doesn't always happen, so then there can be conflicts and misinterpretations and things like that. But what we want to focus on is that the members of OPSI come from the public utility commissions, which may or not represent your interests, and may or not represent what the governor wants if their term is not, hasn't been appointed by the current governor. And we'd note that environmental interests may not be represented. So we're hoping that this would be an encouragement for you to get involved, find out who represents OPSI in your state. And Rich is going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to his slides. Next slide, please. So we're going on to generation sources and trends, and hopefully helping you link it to transmission and to planning. Next slide, please. So obviously generation and other resources are important because that's what you will transmit to meet demand for electricity. And we think we like seeing this in three buckets. The first is generation sources in decline, and to us that means central station oil plants, central station coal plants. The second would be generation sources that we see as having staying power. The largest existing nuclear power, probably central station gas, definitely central cycling and peaking gas, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. And then third, we see emerging and growing sources of generation, and that would be grid scale renewables, renewable power, both solar and on and offshore wind, and importantly, distributed energy resources, smaller solar, storage, and other responsive resources that have enabling technologies, as well as motivating rate designs to be coupled with that. So we're going to talk about how the transmission needs for these sources vary in a few slides, and how and the addition of significant new load like data centers that Miles mentioned is driving other sources of generation. Next slide, please. Miles showed this slide earlier. I want to make a couple of additional points. We use this slide as well frequently. Miles mentioned the levelized cost of energy, and I saw Rich answering some questions in the chat. Can you go to 11, Jesse? Thank you. So localized cost of energy, again, refers to the average cost of generating electricity from a facility over its entire lifespan, including the costs of initial investment, O&M, fuel costs, time value of money, which to give the single metrics that Lazard publishes here. And the headline is there under the second black line that selected energy renewable generation technologies are cost competitive, which Miles discussed. And he showed you how some of the renewable sources are cost competitive with the conventional energy, renewable being in the top, conventional being the bottom. And you'll see that solar plus storage, for example, is also very competitive. And I would note, as somebody asked in the questions, not only are there things not included in these costs, but in particular, the benefits from reduced air pollution are not involved in these calculations. Next slide, please. So let's go back to the old grid for a second. We're moving left to right. This is how we used to generate power, generating from the left all the way to consumers on the right. If we go to the next slide, we're moving to a two-way grid. Energy flowing back and forth, not just from the central stations to customers. The customers are involved here. On the right in the circle, you see different end uses of energy. End uses meaning use, consuming energy, is load, is consuming it. I would want to note that distributed resources such as those mentioned on the right and energy efficiency decrease load, others increase them. In particular, we want to talk about dispatchable and controllable load in the case of storage and microgrids. Energy sources that can send energy back to the grid and reduce load at peak times. So the important thing for you to remember here is that now we're looking at two-way energy from the large sources on the left, smaller sources on the right, both serving the grid and people's needs for electricity. And I believe with that, I'm turning things over to Rich. And the next slide, please.
Hi, thanks, Nancy, and good to be with you all today. And also hello to a few people I know on this webinar. Well, I think what these slides are showing is that there is a lot of change going on, as Miles said. And the good news about change is that it's opportunity for improving. The risk, of course, is that we miss out on those opportunities and in fact go down paths that are ultimately going to waste money, and that could happen too. What I want to talk about with this slide is to introduce a term called net demand. Miles showed you a load shape, his snow-covered peak demand picture earlier on showed a load shape for a day 24 hours that indicated what happens with what people are using with no particular attention to customer resources or customers responding to systems on the grid. And that is represented again here. This is several days. You can see where the weekends are that are like that. But this this next picture, you can advance it a button, Jesse, is to show that the wind and solar that is going on in the grid, which is so cheap, it's really free. We want to take all of it. So if we have net demand, that's the challenge that the grid operator has. If we're going to take all the solar and all the wind, then they don't have to figure out what to do about the grid with that. What they do have to figure out is how to deal with these significant ramps, both down and up. They have to figure out how to deal with baseload generation like nuclear power, which doesn't like to be cycled. And you can see that in some hours in this particular system, which I think is roughly 30 or 40% of energy coming from renewables, it doesn't need any base load at all. And in fact, base load would if you couldn't curtail it, you'd have to just waste the wind and solar. So net demand demonstrates that you can hit the button a couple of times, Jesse, to get the stuff on the bottom of this slide. It decreases the importance of baseload power, increases the importance of resources that can ramp and cycle, that can follow load, things like storage, and recognizes that to really make the most of wind and solar, you have to figure out some of those things. Next slide, Jesse. So transmission planning, the purpose for transmission is changing, and that has to be reflected in transmission to enable all of these new types of resources to come onto the system. And by the way, this is likely to be important for the new administration in forecasting what the new administration is going to be interested in. Republican administrations have tended to be very interested in transmission line construction. And in fact, some of the opportunities to preempt states owing to the national interest were part of a bill that was passed during the Bush administration. And I'm predicting that will get more attention in the new Trump administration. It actually also got attention in the Biden administration. So this is becoming a bipartisan thing to, at least in some ways, factor the national interest into transmission siting. Emissions are a part of every transmission line, as Miles is fond of telling us at RAP, because where the transmission lines go is pretty obvious. It's where the people are. But where they come from, that's where the generation is. And it's important to consider where is the transmission line, other end of the transmission, what generation is enabled by that transmission, and what are the implications of that for all of the states in the area. Next slide. FERC has been taking some actions lately that have been prompting the states to act faster. And the most recent one of those is this Order 1920A. And I add the A because they put out an order earlier that took a lot of power away from the states. And the states went crazy and complained. And the 1920A, which was just issued a couple of weeks ago, gives the states a lot more deference to deal with these key issues of planning the system, picking the assets for the system, and paying for the assets. So these 3 Ps, planning, picking, and paying, are what the Order 1920 is now going to prompt the states to engage with FERC and with each other in the RTO regions. And this presents, I think, an opportunity for air agencies, especially on the picking of resources. How do you choose where ratepayers' money is going to go, and to the extent to which air quality matters. And of course, we don't know how politics is going to change all of this. Next slide. I now want to deal with a point that's, I think, a priority in all of your states, and that is resilience. Resilience is different from reliability, and it is basically involves how tough is it to knock down the grid, and if the grid gets knocked down, how quick can it come back up again? And there have always been concerns about resilience from either natural sources or man-made sources, sometimes sabotage from cyber attacks or other physical ways. But with climate, the risks are growing, the incidences are growing, the 1 in 100-year events seem to be happening much more frequently than that. The 1 in 10-year events seem to be happening more frequently than that. So there are new assets that can be used to address resilience. It's not just about hardening, which is, I think, the first response that a lot of people have to resilience is let's just make it so it's harder to knock down. But another approach is how do we make each piece on the system less important so that if it is knocked down, maybe it has a lesser effect. And one of the ways to do that is to have a lot of distributed resources on the grid, a lot of storage on the grid. So the answers to resilience are changing really fast. Because this is important to a lot of states, it's an opportunity again for clean energy assets, which can also benefit resilience to get some support from the air agencies. Next slide. I want to just reiterate briefly that demand is accelerating after years of stagnation, and we have a history of being very concerned about that from the air quality perspective, because in the past, when demand has gone up, that's meant more combustion. These days, not so much, although it could. There's certainly the advocates for combustion systems are saying that it could. But the great potential, as you saw from the levelized cost of energy slide, is that the best way, the cheapest way to deal with growing load is with clean energy resources. There are some issues with respect to one of the things Miles talked about, which is that making electricity with a rotating machine, creating the magnetic forces that he talked about, is really important. But it turns out that there are other ways to do that too. Electronics can substitute for these magnetic rotating machines. And so each state is going to have is going to be a platform for these arguments. And again, the fact that there are alternatives that don't produce air pollution is something that I think will need support in all of these. And of course, energy efficiency will make all of these challenges less by reducing demand and contributing to the system from the customer side. Next slide. I want to talk about the grid operators. It's easy to feel concern for the grid operators because under their feet, which have been relatively stable for a long time, to run a system that is not changing that much for many years, is changing really fast now. And so all of this change is hard for them. And they have a fundamental trust issue or a control issue when it comes to all of these customer resources, because you can't just call somebody and say, start that engine, and the engine just starts. Instead, there's 10,000 or 100,000 or 1 million people that have to be activated potentially in order to get the result that they want to get from a demand response program or from a storage program where they want to see all of the production from the batteries injected into the grid for some reason, or the other way to soak up all of this energy. So they have trust issues with customer resources, and they're still getting the hang of a lot of the smart systems and tools that are coming onto the system that they have to understand. So they need to be pressed to innovate. And again, the things that they need to innovate toward are going to tend to be beneficial for air quality. The next slide. So this is another use of our term net. I used net demand before. This slide uses the term net load that are the same. And this is only for one day. The slide I showed you before was for several weeks. And what it shows is how the net demand diverges at some point in the morning from the gross demand. And that's because of all of the solar that's coming onto the system, which you can see with the yellow line, to the point where actually for several hours in this particular system, customers are making more energy than their system is using right now, and the energy is backfeeding up into the transmission system. So this two-way grid that Nancy's talking about. And this sort of thing is happening now in many places. I'm not sure if it's happening in the mid-Atlantic states, but it's happening in many places where we get this green effect. This is known as the duck curve in many places, because the belly of the duck is where the green is and the head is to the right, and it sort of looks like a duck floating in the water. But this is typical for a distribution line, and is going to be the kind of issue that states are going to be contending with as this green area gets larger. And the backfeed is important because the transformers, Miles mentioned transformers, are rated to move a certain amount of power, and was designed for the power to all flow in our picture from left to right. But now, coming from right to left, more power perhaps potentially is being pushed in the other direction. And so we have the potential for distribution systems to have to store more of this power so that it doesn't ruin the transformers, which won't be allowed to happen. So we can talk about that later. The next slide is about the environmental implications for all this. And the decision makers, Jesse, you can go ahead. Decision makers do not understand fully the air quality aspects of all of these things. And the story is not written yet either. The ending is unknown. So your participation in helping to write this story in all of your respective states is really critical to influencing what happens. So what do we do? And you can advance to the 2 slides, Jesse, please. The palette of resources has grown, and what should the access to those resources be? In many cases, customers don't know what their power is. They don't know what their options are. In some cases, utilities don't make it easy or even forbid some actions that would be permitted if there was a full consideration of all the pros and cons. That there would be reduced barriers to entry for all of these new resources. And all of the benefits and costs are not necessarily included in the discussion about these things, including about the Clean Air Act and its effect on this. Nancy has educated me over the years about how the Clean Air Act has some interesting power that could affect the choice of clean energy resources. And I think it's important to start asking questions about how that power can be used, not to make yourselves more powerful, but to make the resources that ratepayers are paying for more useful for society and for your states. So a good planning process will do a good job, but it's essential to have experts involved. The next slide is the figure that comes from a report that your neighbors to the north worked on with us, and it shows an array of complementary categories and tactics to address building decarbonization. And Jesse, if you just push the button once, you'll see an arrow that goes to long-term planning. That's the one out of these several things. And so there's all these things that we haven't talked about today. But long-term planning is an important part of how building decarbonization is going to happen. And Jesse, you can go to the next slide. Planning is changing, and this is, I think, the last substantive point I want to make. Some of you are familiar with the integrated resource planning processes in your state, and what is that? Where did that come from? That came from the fact that energy efficiency emerged in the 80s and was not being considered in resource planning by utilities. And so integrated resource planning was something that was created in the 90s and perfected a bit in the 2000s to make sure that energy efficiency was part of a utilities resource planning process. But that's increasingly archaic now because we understand that there are many other customer resources and that there are substitutes for wires investments, that we start talking about non-wires alternatives to substitute for transmission and distribution by using customer resources or other resources. So this now comes up with a new term that some of your states are using, and maybe some of your states are going to consider, called integrated grid planning. And that's starting to come into vogue, but even that is perhaps not where we're ending up, because with electricity substituting now for natural gas in electrification applications, the notion of integrated energy planning, which is not in use anywhere yet, but I think it will be because we have a dozen states now across the country that have future of gas dockets underway, including some of your states. Integrated energy planning, I think, is where we're headed. And that's all I'll say about that right now. And you can move on to the next slide. We're almost done. So if you had a seat at the table where energy decisions are made, what would you ask for and what would you bargain for? And we have a couple of prompts for you on the next slide, which, Jesse, you can show, which have to do with the gas transition. Do we need gas for some things, or do we just want it for some things, but maybe it's better to substitute? The time of day matters. We know it matters for air pollution. We know it matters for energy. How are those two questions brought together? Peak demand is very expensive to serve. A massive amount of money is spent on the most 80 hours, 1% of the hours of the year. And transmission can help us with air quality. It can also not. And so here are some ideas for things that you might ask. And so we can go to the end, Jesse. I think this will be it.
Now, Rich, I'm coming back on.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. As Rich said, just a few more slides. We want to talk about those questions a little bit and help you give some, maybe prompt some questions. So we want to talk about these three distinct cases. The first is data centers, which we know is of great concern in your area and is leading to a lot of load growth and requests for permitting of gas resources. We're positing that maybe you don't need all those gas resources for two reasons. Some of the people who are trying to put in place the data centers are folks like Google or Amazon, who have corporate sustainability goals that mean they may not want to see new fossil resources that would be attributed to them. And second, given their visibility, they may be open to alternatives, such as new renewable energy plus storage. Or some of their data centers may be interruptible while they shift to data centers in another part of the country where demand is not at peak. The second thing on peak demand nope, not there yet, is that it's different from resilience. And there's two things we want to pose for your consideration. The cost of meeting peak is very high. Systems need to be built to them. And certainly, frequently the peak occurs in summer or winter, corresponding to high air pollution days, since often the oldest and dirtiest units are called into service, though I'm not talking about wildfire days, obviously. And since peak drives costs and air quality, we're hoping you were interested in what you can do about that. And we want to utilize the two-way grid And for all three of these sectors in different ways to try to reduce those peaks. For industry, for example, households could do something like if people understand how to use the delay cycle on their washing machines and their dishwashers. That's one way to shift demand off of peak time, or electric vehicle charging. Industries may rely on their own generation or lowering their demand or shifting to other locations. And data centers, as mentioned above, can shift to other areas or use their own renewables. And a lot of these cases also can be helped by new rate designs that would help shift loads, providing incentives for all of these categories. But we thought that was a discussion for another day. But we know there's a lot of interest and challenges, so please raise your questions when we get to that. Next slide, please, now. So just to put a fine point on this issue of peak demand, this graph is showing 8760 hours in the year. It is from Rhode Island. It is from 2016, but the point is still very valid. That the top 1% of 8760 hours, in other words, 80 hours, 90, represents 9% of the spending. Or the top 10% or 900 hours is 26% of the spending on the grid in the year. So if we can move away from usage in that time and fall down to using different resources, there's cost saving, there's grid management benefits, and this also provides incentives to shift load and to do some of the things Rich was talking about. We want to use that more flexible load that can be shifted to avoid these peaks. Next slide, please. I used this slide in the last time we were speaking to MARAMA. It's the PJM Now app, which you may find of use because you can follow real-time demand in your area, generation sources, and pricing. But before you check that out and go to your phone, go to the next slide, which is our last substantive slide with our key takeaway. So we want to reiterate that your voice is critical in bringing essential information to these discussions, which no one else is going to do. And you want to be there so that you can influence the new forms of investments in energy and energy investments, which will have decades-long implication and affect air quality. Collaboration will work better if you focus on maybe some distinct cases, as we've discussed. We hope we've showed you how to model and bring your interests to bear, because your role is so critical in how the grid develops and the sources that are used to power demand and avoid additional gas units and other fossil units. We feel that no one else can provide the input that you all can. And we know you have a lot on your plate. We're offering this as a way to help make your job easier going forward, while recognizing that it's an investment that you would need to make now in new areas and new collaborations to ensure the future looks better for air quality. And with that, the next slide has our contact information. And then we're happy to take questions and have discussion. And I think at least this poll I see, and I hope folks can fill in with areas and issues that they're interested in learning more about. Jesse, if there's other instructions for folks, please chime in.
Yep, if people can respond to the poll, that would be helpful, and then I can share the results with attendees as well as us. This is more for us to figure out what kind of resources might be needed moving forward, based on the remaining questions and concerns you all have. But if anybody has questions right now, we do have a few minutes left, so you could put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A function. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, and I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A box. Let's see, no raised hands, so. We'll just give people a couple minutes at least to respond to this poll, and then share those responses in case anybody else is interested in seeing those.
Okay, now I'm seeing a couple questions. So from Catherine Salerano, how do states deal with reliability must-run RMR orders for coal-fired units? Does an RMR trump environmental policies like permit limits, required use of controls, etc.?
Ooh.
Oh my gosh, I ride past this power plant literally twice a day on my bicycle. Rich, can I take a crack at that?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so like, the way that people think about power is pretty straightforward. You have to have power to worry about whether it's affordable or clean. So reliability tends to boss everybody else out of the room. If you say, that power plant is running over its air permit week after week after week, and we got to shut that thing down, and it's going to create a reliability problem to shut that thing down, then there are a couple different kinds of mechanisms that can be used to keep that plant open over and above the objections of people worried about its affordability and its environmental attributes. The RMR designation that you raised in that question is excellent. I get the feeling you actually know more about this than your question posits here. There's this way you can keep a plant going, which is the Department of Energy can say that they can designate a power plant to be a reliability must-run unit. And in Alexandria, Virginia, my hometown, we have a power plant called the Potomac Generating Station that was in rampant violation of its air permits for years. And the Virginia DEQ came in and said, we're going to find the socks off you guys, and if you keep doing it, we're going to tell you to shut down. The DOE took a look at the needs of the District of Columbia right across the Potomac River and said, actually, we need that unit for a little while until PJM can run another transmission line under the Potomac River into the district. It's a 500 megawatt unit, coal-fired, and it kept running in rampant violation of its air permit until that power line was run underneath there. That unit actually hasn't run in about, I want to say about 15 years, but I literally ride 100 feet away from the turbine room of that power plant, which has been sitting there unused for over a decade, every day on my way to work on my bicycle. Big sore point. But yes, the reliability concerns in a bunch of different ways, a few different ways, can trump and override the environmental permits and concerns.
The insight that I'd like you to take away from this question is that there are two major ways that we talk about these things. One is, how does the operator operate the pieces on the board right now? And that's where RMR comes in. But the other thing to think about is, how does the system motivate investment in new pieces for the board? And one issue that I think addresses this question is, how can the new pieces on the board make RMR less needed?
And that's Rich. Well done. That's what I tried to put in a comment in the chat box. Very similar to what Rich just mentioned.
That's right. Nobody wants the RMR, because if you got an RMR, you're running probably an uneconomic unit. You're running, it's not just the environmental questions. You're probably running a deeply unpopular in its community unit. You're running a unit that must run, not we love running it. And yeah, you want to really, if you get to a situation where you've got an RMR unit, that's a pretty big failure of both the market and the regulatory structure and the planning by the jurisdictions, but more importantly, by the people who are in charge of making sure there's resource adequacy in power plants and stuff like that.
But you guys get drawn sometimes into the operating situation, and this is when the bad decisions have already been long made. I think the real value for you guys is in the planning that will lead to the new things and which new things are selected.
Rich, there's a good question about FERC in the Q&A about EPA engaging with FERC. I believe that's happened some. I'm not aware of any particulars.
Well, in fact, Congress sometimes gets mad at FERC for dealing with the EPA. At least some congressmen who believe that FERC has nothing to do with the environment. So I would say that different FERC commissioners in the past have risked the ire of Congress and done more with EPA than others have done. The best thing, of course, though, is to reflect not just on the EPA regulations, but to consider the risks that future EPA regulations will have on the public interest for the transmission system. It's important, I think, for FERC to feel like they're focusing on their kitchen, and their kitchen is the energy system, but they can think about risks that are going to affect their kitchen, and that's the way that they can wrap things like the potential for future environmental regulations and their implications into their thinking. But they have to be very careful about the way they do it.
Tim, I see your question there, and I'm just going to add one last thing to it, which is you always ask the best questions. I don't know what Omaha is doing on a MARAMA webcast, but it's great, and I love it. And EPA should be doing it more, and FERC should be doing it more. It's an area of policy failure that I think you'd agree, and we'd all agree, people should get out of their swim lanes and be a little more comfortable coordinating. It's a great question.
And now Valerie's got one. Hello, Valerie. It's a great question in the chat. How do air qualities leverage the GATS system to support the work of the commissions?
Well, Nancy, as you'll remember, when I was in the government and you were, we helped to create the ISO generation information system in which every megawatt hour was tagged with attributes, including their emissions attributes. And when I joined RAP, we were working on that with the PJM GIS system as well. They have that capability. It's actually there. Nobody ever asks about it. And if a state were to create some sort of environmental emissions standard for NOx or something else that is tracked by PJM, the PJM system could report on that. And some of your states have label requirements for the retail power producers. I don't know if anybody pays attention, but there is a label that comes with your service that shows you where the energy comes from, and also could show, if the state required it, the NOx per kilowatt hour for power, and a state could decide we're going to actually create a more stringent NOx requirement per kilowatt hour than none exists today, but you could create one, and you could create one that declines over time if you wanted to. So, but at the very least, you could use it to generate information, and you could generate it in a label that is already probably happening in some of your states, but it's in the noise and nobody pays attention to it.
I just want to interrupt a little bit and add on to Miles's question. What is the guy from Omaha doing on this webinar? MARAMA is an equal opportunity organization, and we don't feel that, knowledge should have boundaries. So as you, Miles, we love you, as well as Nancy and Richard, bringing this information to everyone we can reach.
Thanks for that, Mark. And thanks all of you for the questions. I'm glad we were able to get to them without going too much over time. I do apologize for the technological issues that we had, but that's always how it goes, right? And thanks for everybody's attention, and thank you so much for the excellent presentations, Miles, Nancy, and Rich. And we will be in touch with you all for future educational opportunities on this topic. And you should all also get a recording in a follow-up email after this presentation is over. All right. Hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Happy holidays.